Good morning. Welcome to the SBC Daily Word for Thursday, May 27th. We're going to be looking this morning at one of the more common sections in the book of Ecclesiastes. Probably if you were to ask at the beginning of this study, what section of Ecclesiastes are we familiar with? It would be this poem that we find in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 because of that oldies song by the Byrds, Turn, Turn, Turn. Well, that comes directly from this text. Within Ecclesiastes, again, as we've reviewed every time we've been together, so you've got kind of two authors to keep in mind. You've got Solomon, who the compiler, the editor of Ecclesiastes, has taken these words that Israel has preserved, and then now as they've gotten after the exile, life has calmed down. This teacher, this preacher, is now going to take on the persona of Solomon, this wise, ancient sage, that his listeners are going to assign much authority to his voice. And as they get into this post-exile existence, the compiler, the teacher, who is now using Solomon's words to teach his audience, is basically concerned with this. I'm afraid that Israel is now going to go the way of one of its greatest kings. It's going to get seduced by wealth, by power, by resources, by pleasure. So what the teacher, the compiler of Ecclesiastes is doing is taking the words of Solomon to remind us that if we assign our life's meaning to anything under the sun, anything independent of God and his future for us, it will lead to Hebel. It will lead to vanity. It will lead to meaninglessness. So let me just read chapter 3, verses 1 to 15, because I kind of want us to get us a feel for this text. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. The goal of this poem is to kind of create this lyrical awe in the hearer. This poem is meant to be heard and to kind of see within the almost sing-songy nature of this poem, even in English, that there is kind of this rhyme and rhythm to the times. This question of this poem wants the hearer to ask this question: what time is it? Not only what time does our Fitbit or our Apple Watch or our phone say, but what times are we in? And more specifically, what task is appropriate to this time? The time that you are in at your age versus the time that I am in my age could be remarkably different. But what this poem tells us is there is a time for every task. William Brown, in his commentary on Ecclesiastes, says this: even though humanity is the grammatical subject of the various infinitives, a time to, a time to, a time to, people plant and pluck up, people mourn and dance, the human subject is by no means the determiner of such events. The teacher makes clear that God alone is the one who determines. God is the primary, albeit implicit, actor on the scene of history. The ever-constant swings of time's pendulum are suspended and held firmly by God. So again, what the teacher is wanting to do with this poem that Solomon wrote is to help the hearer understand that consider how history moves in this swinging of the pendulum. There's a time for this and a time for this. And what the poem is designed to do is to create this lyrical awe, so that then we will begin to consider that under the sun isn't the only place, that what we see under the sun isn't the only thing that's real. So the thing that the poem wants to create awe about is time. Sidney Greidanus says the poem uses the word time 28 times. Okay? Then there's this weird within the lines of the poem, 4 lines and then 7 uses of time. And then these 28 times are distributed over 14 lines. Since 7 is the number of completeness, the author, without naming all possible times, intends to depict the different number of different times humans may encounter in their lifetime. So again, he's telling us, and again, especially if you are perhaps in the last third of your life, this is something you see. This is something that you see. Time and history tends to have this rhythm to it. Solomon at the end of his life, and this teacher wants us to see that wisdom. So this is a poem on the times. Now, verse 9 gives us a conclusion. What gain have the workers from their toil? The way that that's answered implies that there will be a negative response. Gain, eternal meaning, does not come to those who simply toil through time. Now, a few reflections are going to be offered to us before a conclusion. The first reflection, look at verse 10. I have seen the busyness that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. So the reflection that the author gives us here is that God has sovereignly connected time and task. In other words, you don't want to be grieving during a time when they're supposed to be dancing. You don't want to be killing during a time of healing. You don't want to be throwing away stones when it's time to be gathering stones. You don't want to be embracing when it's a time to refrain from embracing. So again, the wisdom teacher here is causing us to ask throughout our days, what time is it? And what task is appropriate to this time? Second reflection is found in the second half of verse 11. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, the minds of humanity, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So again, especially if you're listening to this and you find yourself in the last third of your life, you can resonate with this, that there is this notion of, in your life, a time of reminiscing about the past, and then also perhaps imagining what might the future be like. And there's yet this feeling of, it's still difficult to discern. How does it all fit together? Even as you get to the last third of your life, there's probably things that you can look at in your past that you know they're significant, yet you just know that connecting the dots between that event and ultimate reality is something that is like 10,000 slots above our pay grade. So what Solomon and the teacher who's compiling his teachings here does for us is says that if we live life in a wise way, when we consider time, history, and future, the result should be humility. The result should be, God is telling a story, and I do not have the ability to be able to connect all those dots. So then there's a conclusion. This rhythm of time, this humility of not being able to piece everything together. Verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. I know that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor anything taken from it. God has done this so that all should stand in awe before him. That which is already has been. That which is to be already is. And God seeks out what has gone by. So ultimately, with all of this consideration of what time is it, what task is appropriate to that time, the humility that comes from at the end of our life looking back at the past and knowing there's significance, looking into the future and knowing this somehow all fits together, but only God can figure out, the answer is be present in the moment and enjoy the present moment we find ourselves in. Beloved, we need to regularly ask, as individuals, as families, and as congregations, what time is it? What time do we find ourselves in as an individual? First, second, third of life. Families, what time are you in your family timeline? As congregations, time for rest, time for work, time for redirection, time for reorientation. We need to regularly ask, what time is it? And then after discerning what time it is, to then ask, what is Jesus calling us to do? Because ultimately, the scriptures reveal that time has been moving toward Jesus Christ. Paul says this in Galatians 4. So with us, while we were minors, we were enslaved to the elemental spirits of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. That ultimately, time finds its fulfillment in Jesus. Beloved, I want to resist the temptation to start to talk to you about what time I think it is, what time you think it is, then what tasks are appropriate to that time, but to be a people who listen to the wisdom of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, and the teacher who compiled these teachings, and to say, what time is it, and what tasks do we find ourselves in? There's a few quotes that I'd like to leave with you just to kind of emphasize the type of tasks that are appropriate to every time. If you find yourself young, if you find yourself middle, if you find yourself old, if you find yourself in the first third, the second third, or the third third of your life, following Jesus in the way of love is appropriate regardless of time. Henry Nouwen, a great spiritual teacher of the Catholic tradition, says this: the people who love me are always the ones who hurt me because they also have needs. God's love is a love that isn't wounding because it's eternal. God loves me from all eternity to all eternity. Life, this little bit of life, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years, is not very long. It's just one little chance for us to say yes to them. We love you too. That's what life is about. And that chance to say yes is what time is about. Kairos, not chronos. Kairos, the other Greek word for time, means opportunity to change your heart. There are as many opportunities to change your heart as there are events that are part of it. Everything is an opportunity to change your heart, no matter what time you're in, to change your heart. A friend to visit, the mother who comes to visit, the museum, whatever, that's life. Looked on from below, it's chronos. I have to survive. I have to fight my way through it. Looked at from above, it is kairos. It is the opportunity to change your heart in everything you do. Beloved, no matter what third of your life you find yourself in, there is a task that is appropriate to that time. And that time looks like changing your heart by the grace of God toward love. May grace and peace and everything good be yours.